say that if your marshal is responsible in any measure for the violations of the laws of war committed by the men under his command in the Philippines, anything less than the death sentence would be a mockery. We therefore respectfully recommend that if the accused is found guilty as charged, the sentence be death.
It was very easy for the Americans to take over the lowlands of the Philippines, but the mountains were very different, because in the mountains were the Igorots, and they took people's heads. And they sent to America, to Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, for school teachers. And they brought them here to the Philippines on a ship named the Thomas, and they called them the Thomasites. They then took wagons and came up to Baguio on a very primitive trail and road. And when they got here, they made a camp, and then each teacher was given books and pencils and sent into the mountains to live with headhunters. Now, I don't know whether you know anything about teachers. When the teacher is in the classroom, the teacher tells the kids what to do. And they start schools in all these remote villages.
The same man who planned the city of Manila, Daniel Burnham, also planned Baguio, which is why you have a Burnham Park. And it was a very modern American-style city. And in order to maintain the security of the area, two camps were established. One was Camp Henry T. Allen, which was for the Philippine Constabulary, local police forces. And the other camp that was established was Camp John Hay. Basic garrison troops would actually be majority Filipinos who belonged to what was called the Philippine Scouts. Now, the Philippine Scouts were a unique organization within the U.S. Army. They had originally been mobilized to fight against the independence forces in 1899. Initially, they were locally recruited from various parts of the Philippines, but by 1901, they were consolidated under one organization called the Philippine Scouts. So all the soldiers, all the enlisted men, and most of the non-commissioned officers were themselves Filipino, but the officers would be American. So this became a very strong unit of the U.S. Army in the Philippines, perhaps in fact the most professional unit of soldiers in the Philippines, who were Filipinos who were trained in American military methods. So the Camp John Hay was the base of this particular Philippine Scout unit. It also served as a rest and recreation area for the U.S. Army forces in the Philippines. We have to start at the beginning with why the Americans were here in the first place. At the time, the Philippines was a Spanish colony. With the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, Commodore Dewey was ordered to send his Asiatic squadron to Manila Bay to destroy the Spanish squadron here. There were Americans who opted to colonize the Philippines, and this would provide a strategic position for the U.S. Navy. So as Commodore Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet on May 1, 1898, the decision was made to take the Philippines, initially Luzon, and then later on the whole Philippines. Spain eventually gave up their claims to the Philippines, and the Philippines became an American colony under the provisions of the Treaty of Paris of December of 1898. Then the Philippine government at that time, which was a very young government, decided to fight the Americans. In 1899, what was called the Philippine-American War broke out, and this lasted for several years. There was resistance on many islands, And in particular, one island was the island of Samar. And the Americans had established a garrison in the town of Balangiga. This garrison had established its own position, its own camp. The resistance forces there attacked them by surprise. This was September of 1901. To signal the attack by the Filipino resistance forces, church bells were rung. And when the church bells rang, the Filipino resistance fighters, some of whom were dressed in women's clothes, attacked the American garrison and killed several of the members. And the local commander, General Smith, decided to turn Samar into a howling wilderness. And when he was asked what was the age range that they would kill, General Smith is supposed to have said any male above 10 who was capable of bearing arms. This resulted in a major massacre, and it was investigated by the U.S. Army. It was seen as a crime against the local people and so forth. And the American General Smith was recalled and court-martialed. But because the church bells rang the signal to attack on the Philippine side, the American forces in Samar took the church bells as booty, 2 of them in the States, 1 of them to Korea, and there they remained as war booty. And officially the U.S. government would say the war would end in 1902, but resistance against the Americans continued in various other places of the Philippines for a long time. But eventually the Philippines did become a pacified American colony, and the Americans would set up a military garrison to ensure peace and order and also to protect American interests in the area. While the garrison was based mainly in Manila, it was decided to set up camps all throughout the Philippines to ensure regional security. And one area that they wanted to build was the area that became known as Baguio.
Manuel Louis Quetzon is inaugurated as the first president of the newly formed Philippine Commonwealth. Watching the ceremony is Vice President Garner and 17 other members of the United States Senate. For 37 years, America has ruled the 7,000-odd islands which make up the Philippine archipelago. Now, following the precedent set by Great Britain with her colonies, the Filipinos are to be given the opportunity of governing themselves.
From 1901 up to 1935, the Philippines was directly under American rule. In 1916, an act was passed by the U.S. Congress. This was called the Jones Law, which granted the Philippines more autonomy. And you also had in the Jones Law the promise of eventual independence. And so that made many Filipinos happy that the American rule would not last forever. It was not like the British, it was not like the French in Southeast Asia, where there were no promises of independence. And so eventually, in 1934, a bill would be finally passed in the United States, which would be called the Tidings-McDuffie Bill. It became law, and this would now state that the Philippines would be granted independence after a 10-year transition period. That would be 1946. In the process, the Philippines would put up a government, which would be called the Commonwealth government. So, President of the Commonwealth of the Philippines was Manuel Quezon. He was elected in 1935, and the Commonwealth government began operations in November of 1935.
We are about to establish and put into operation the government of the Commonwealth of the Philippines as ordained by the Congress of the United States. I, Manuel Luis Quezon, hereby solemnly swear that I will faithfully and conscientiously fulfill my duties as President of the Philippines, and I hereby declare that I recognize and accept the supreme authority of the United States of America in the Philippines, and will maintain true faith and allegiance thereto. So help me God.
I'm living in Baguio in northern Luzon. I actually was born here in Baguio, so this for me is just a natural homecoming. And When I was born, the war had not started, and I'm talking about World War II. So I had 4 years of living in a real paradise. The Philippines was just marvelous. I don't think there was any place in the world that was better to live in. And I'm talking about many, many things. Economically, militarily, civilian life was fabulous. It was clean, it was beautiful, and it was a great place for a kid to grow up.
This was a peacetime situation. Prices were low, transportation was working well. The Philippines has the longest Christmas season, and as early as October, November, people were thinking of Christmas and preparing for a Happy New Year and all of this. President Quezon was sick, he had tuberculosis, and so in early December he went up to Baguio, and he was there to recuperate, to rest, and to enjoy the cool weather.
Advancing inland, the rising sun forces quickly conquer nearby Suzhou and Hangzhou to the south. They drive up the Yangtze River toward the provincial capital, Nanking. As the enemy draws near, Chiang moves the capital east to Chongqing. The Japanese air forces viciously bomb the civilian sectors of Nanking. Their army routs the undertrained, outgunned Chinese defenders. The fall of the city on 13 December sparks a wave of atrocities by the victorious Japanese. Troops rape thousands of Chinese women and force thousands more into sexual slavery. Some 40,000 Chinese civilians are tortured and killed. Women and children are buried alive. The world is outraged and condemns this rape of Nanking.
While war was going on in China, it had gone on since 1937, it was felt that the Japanese would not dare strike the Philippines. Life was going on.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Pearl Harbor was bombed December 8, Philippine time. I think it was Quezon's secretary in Malacanang Palace who called Quezon up very early in the morning to tell him that war has started, Pearl Harbor has been attacked, and that the U.S. is at war with Japan. Quezon immediately ordered the whole government on war footing. This was about 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning. And 2 hours later, that's when the Japanese bombers flew. Planes were flying over Baguio. Bombs were dropped. The Japanese target was Camp John Hay.
I went to the church because it is my birthday. And then I was inside the church. The people told me that John Hay was bombed and we are all frightened.
I am 8 years old when the Japanese bombed the Camp John Hay. The first bomb of the John Hay, it was 1941, December.
I was then 3 years old during World War II. We were living in the barrio of Tubao, La Union. During that time, I was so carefree. I was so ignorant, seeing what was happening during that time. I would see burning houses in the distance, fire, airplanes crashing with one another. I was so carefree then I kept clapping at my hands.
The first air raid on Camp John Hay resulted in 11 dead and around 30, 40 wounded. And for the residents of Baguio and for those in Camp John Hay, this was the first time they ever saw bombs dropped in anger. And that in itself was the shock. The first time they saw people who were killed by an act of war. And those who were wounded, the 29 or so who were injured because of the bombing, that itself would tax the medical facilities of Baguio.